If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more epic HFY tales every day. Don't miss out on the next adventure. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to know when a new story drops. Liking this video helps us bring you more incredible stories, so smash that like button if you're ready for more. What would you do if you were in this situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of this story surprised you the most? Share your reactions in the comments. I love reading what you think. If you could add one twist to this story, what would it be? Let's get creative in the comments. What do you think happens next in the human versus alien saga? Let's discuss your theories below. The alien king had once ruled over vast expanses of the galaxy, his empire stretching farther than most could imagine. His name had been synonymous with power, wisdom, and a brutal efficiency that kept his enemies at bay. He was revered not for his kindness, but for his command of the most advanced technology in the universe, for his ability to conquer without mercy. His species, known for their cold logic and emotional detachment, had long seen themselves as the pinnacle of galactic evolution. They believed their intellectual superiority gave them the right to rule, and the king was the embodiment of this belief. The king had always known the weight of his throne. He had ruled with a strategic mind, calculating every move like the turns in a complex game of chess. But he never doubted the loyalty of his subjects. They had been bred to value the empire's strength above all else, and as long as he remained the strongest, they would remain loyal. Then came the war. Not just any war, but a galactic conflict unlike any his empire had faced before. Entire systems were consumed in the chaos. Planets were scorched, and his armies, once invincible, faced a foe that seemed to anticipate their every move. Allies turned on him, enemies grew bold, and the king's once unassailable throne began to tremble beneath him. His armies faltered, and the casualties mounted. For the first time, his people began to whisper, quietly at first, but growing louder as the war dragged on. They questioned his leadership, his ability to protect them. It wasn't long before the whispers became open dissent. And finally, the unthinkable happened. His own council, those he had trusted most, called a meeting in his absence. Their decision was unanimous. The king was to be abandoned, seen as a liability now, a relic of a past that no longer suited their future. The vote was swift. His generals, his advisors, those who had once pledged their loyalty without question, turned their backs on him. They left him with nothing but cold stares as they slipped away in their ships, abandoning him to the battlefield, where he had barely survived the latest assault. Wounded, exhausted, and betrayed, the king could only watch as the last of his loyal fleet vanished into the void, leaving him alone on a desolate planet. The planet was a wasteland, the kind of place no species would willingly choose to inhabit. The air was thin, barely breathable, and the ground was barren. Strange winds whipped across the surface, carrying dust and debris that stung at the king's exposed skin. He could feel the weight of gravity pressing down on his body, making every movement a struggle. He was no longer the ruler of an empire. He was just another stranded being, left to die. For days, he lay in the ruins of his ship, his body broken, his mind spinning in disbelief. He had never imagined this end. His species, so devoid of sentiment, had always prided themselves on their ability to make the hard choices. Sacrificing him, the king, had been seen as a logical decision, nothing more. His own people were not capable of betrayal in the human sense. They simply calculated that he was no longer worth saving. Logic dictated that he be left behind, expendable, a casualty of war that could not be afforded further resources. But the king was not dead. His body, though ravaged by the battle and his crash landing, still clung to life. Barely. His advanced biology and cybernetic enhancements kept him alive, but only just. His once proud form was now a shadow of its former glory. Every breath was a laborious effort, each heartbeat a reminder of his fading strength. As he lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, his mind returned to the decision that had sealed his fate. His people had left him because he had failed. In their eyes, failure was unforgivable. It was a sign of weakness, and weakness could not be tolerated. Loyalty was conditional, based solely on the continuation of power. There was no room for sentiment, no allowance for mistakes. His people were a species of perfectionists, and he had become an imperfection. He wondered if this was the end. Alone on a planet that offered no sustenance, no hope of rescue, he contemplated his death. The thought of it did not bring fear. Fear was an emotion his species had long suppressed, but rather a cold acceptance. He had lived by the rules of logic, and now those rules had sentenced him to die. But even in his darkest moments, as his body teetered on the edge of survival, something stirred in the back of his mind. The humans. They were a species that defied everything he had come to know about sentient life. Illogical, emotional, and unpredictable, the humans had been a constant thorn in his empire's side. They were inferior in almost every measurable way, physically weaker, technologically behind, and yet, they had never fallen. Despite their limitations, the humans had survived, even thrived, in the harshest conditions. They were a wild card, a species that refused to be categorized or dismissed. As he lay on the brink of death, the king couldn't help but wonder if the humans would have made the same choice his people had. Would they have abandoned their leader in the face of adversity? Would they have left one of their own to die, simply because it was the logical thing to do? The idea seemed absurd. In all his encounters with humans, one thing had always stood out: their loyalty. It was not based on logic or reason. It was born from something deeper, something he had never fully understood. They fought for each other, even when it made no sense. They died for each other, even when survival dictated otherwise. It was this irrational loyalty that made them so dangerous, and so fascinating. The king's vision blurred as he slipped closer to unconsciousness. The harsh winds of the planet howled around him, but in his mind, there was only silence. He had been abandoned, left to die by those who once followed him without question. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a single thought persisted. The humans would never have done this. And with that thought, a strange, fleeting sense of hope flickered in his chest, irrational, illogical, but undeniable. Perhaps, in this cold and uncaring universe, the humans were the only ones left who still knew how to care. The humans arrived on the barren planet by sheer accident, a group of explorers on a mission far removed from the conflicts of the galaxy. Their ship, a patchwork of human ingenuity, was far less impressive than the sleek vessels of other species. They were not the strongest, nor the most advanced, but they had a resilience that set them apart. They were survivors, adaptable and determined. In a galaxy filled with towering, fearsome beings, the humans often seemed out of place, smaller, more fragile. Yet somehow. At first, they didn't notice the alien king. The planet was a wasteland, after all. Their scanners had shown no signs of life, and the harsh environment wasn't conducive to lengthy stays. But as they moved through the wreckage of an old battlefield, one of the soldiers caught sight of a figure, barely discernible among the debris. The alien king was motionless, his body partially covered by rubble, his once great form reduced to little more than a broken shell. The humans approached cautiously, weapons drawn, unsure of what they were dealing with. They could tell he was different, powerful, even in his weakened state. The symbols etched into his armor marked him as royalty, or something close to it. His species was unfamiliar to them, but his condition was clear. He was dying. There was a brief moment of hesitation. The humans, despite their empathy, were not reckless. This being was an unknown. He could be dangerous. But something about his state, the way he lay there on the edge of death, sparked a discussion among the group. Some suggested leaving him. After all, this wasn't their fight, and helping could invite trouble. Others argued that they couldn't just abandon him. He was still alive, and that alone was reason enough to act. The debate didn't last long. One of the human soldiers, a medic, knelt beside the alien king, her decision made. Despite the risks, despite the unknown, she couldn't stand by and watch him die. She wasn't certain if their medical supplies would work on him, but she tried anyway, administering what little aid she could. The others, seeing her resolve, followed suit, offering water and food, though they had no idea if his body could even process it. The alien king, though barely conscious, registered their actions. His species had long been devoid of such emotional responses. They were pragmatic, efficient, and calculated in all their dealings. The idea of helping someone simply because they needed help was foreign to him. Yet here were these humans, risking their own safety for a being they didn't know, for a cause that wasn't theirs. As he lay there, slowly regaining his strength, the king found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. He had been betrayed by his own people, left to die because they had deemed it logical. And yet these humans, who had no reason to care, were doing everything they could to keep him alive. It didn't make sense. Why would they do this? What did they stand to gain? His pride bristled at the thought of accepting their help. He was a king, a ruler of an empire that had once spanned the stars. To be reduced to this, to relying on the kindness of a species so far beneath him, was almost unbearable. But as much as he wanted to push them away, to cling to the remnants of his dignity, his survival instinct overruled his pride. He needed them. That much was clear. The humans worked tirelessly, tending to his wounds and making sure he had the nourishment he needed. They were cautious, of course, but not fearful. They treated him like they would any other injured being, with a mix of professionalism and genuine concern. The king could see their camaraderie, their trust in each other. It was something he had never experienced, not in the way they displayed it. His own people had been bound by duty, by a shared goal of expansion and control. But these humans were bound by something deeper, something more elusive. As the days passed, the king's strength began to return. He still didn't speak much. His pride kept him from expressing any sort of gratitude, but he observed. The humans were always talking, always planning. They worked together with an ease that astonished him. Every decision was discussed, debated, and made collectively. There was no supreme leader, no hierarchy that demanded absolute obedience. It was strange, and yet somehow it worked. He couldn't understand it. His people had always relied on order, on strict control. Without it, they believed chaos would reign. Yet these humans, with their emotions and their seeming lack of structure, operated in perfect harmony. It defied logic. But then again, everything about them seemed to defy logic. The king's internal conflict grew with each passing day. On the one hand, he was grateful, though he wouldn't admit it, to be alive, and he owed that life to these humans. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling of inferiority that came with his reliance on them. His people would have called it weakness, and perhaps it was. But he also couldn't deny the strength he saw in the humans, a strength that came not from physical power or technological superiority, but from something deeper. He began to interact with them more, slowly at first. It was difficult, his pride always in the way, but he couldn't help his curiosity. He asked questions, trying to understand their motivations, their way of life. The humans answered freely, without hesitation. They spoke of loyalty, of protecting each other no matter the cost. It wasn't about logic or gain, it was about doing what was right. The king found this concept strange, but he couldn't dismiss it. The more he learned, the more he realized how different they were from his own kind. His people had abandoned him because it was logical, because his death would not harm their overall plans. The humans, however, had risked everything to save him, a stranger, simply because they believed it was the right thing to do. It was a kind of loyalty he had never known, and it unsettled him. Yet, despite his unease, the king found himself drawn to these humans. Their teamwork, their unwavering support for one another, it was something he had never experienced before. Slowly, his defenses began to lower. He started sharing more about himself, about his people, though he kept certain details vague. The humans listened without judgment, always curious, always willing to learn. There were moments when the king wanted to retreat back into his shell of pride and superiority, to remind himself that he was above these beings. But each time, he found it harder to justify. The humans had shown him something his own people never could: compassion. And as much as he hated to admit it, that compassion was what had kept him alive. As the days turned into weeks, the king's relationship with the humans grew stronger. He still couldn't fully grasp their way of thinking, their emotions and their empathy, but he began to understand why they were so dangerous. They fought for more than just survival, they fought for each other. And that, the king realized, was a strength far greater than any technology or strategic mind could ever provide. The alien king had regained much of his strength by now, but with that strength came the realization of a new danger. The humans had helped him recover, yet they had no idea of the forces that still hunted him. As they scanned the skies for any sign of life or danger, it became clear: his empire was not simply in chaos. A faction of rebels, his former subjects, had risen in his absence. They were determined to finish what they had started and claim control of his empire. They wanted him dead, and they were coming. The news came through the human scanners. At first, they didn't fully understand what they were looking at, just a signal, distant but unmistakably directed toward their position. But the king knew. These were not just random ships. This was an organized hunt. His own people had deemed him a liability, but now this rebel faction saw him as a threat to their rise. If he lived, they would never secure control over the empire. The humans, upon hearing the king's explanation, fell silent. They knew what this meant. They had stumbled into a conflict far greater than their own mission. The enemy was on its way, an enemy far more technologically advanced, more numerous, and with a singular goal: the king's death. For a brief moment, there was tension among the group. They had helped the king out of compassion, out of a sense of duty to preserve life, but now that decision carried with it the weight of war. They could flee, leave the king to his fate, and avoid being drawn into a conflict they had no stake in. It would be the safe choice, the logical choice. But the humans were not driven by logic alone. A discussion began, weighing their options. Some argued that they should cut their losses. After all, what could a small human crew do against an entire rebel fleet? They were explorers, not soldiers. Their technology was inferior, their numbers few. Staying to fight was a death sentence. But others, including their leader, took a different stance. They had saved the king's life. They had chosen to help him when no one else would. Abandoning him now would be a betrayal of everything they stood for. It wasn't just about survival. It was about loyalty. The human leader's decision was clear: they would stand by the king. Even if the odds were against them, even if the fight seemed unwinnable, they would not leave him to face this alone. The king, watching this exchange, felt something stir within him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: humility. He had been raised to believe in his superiority, in the natural order of things, where the strong ruled and the weak perished. But here were these humans, weaker by every measurable standard, choosing to risk everything for him, a being they barely knew. It didn't make sense, but at the same time, it made perfect sense. It was their loyalty, their honor. These were concepts that his people had long discarded, but the humans held them close. As the humans prepared for what was to come, the king found himself questioning everything he had been taught. Why were they doing this? What could they possibly gain from fighting a battle they were destined to lose? He couldn't understand it, but he could no longer deny it. They were risking their lives for him, not because it was logical, but because it was right. It was then that the king made a decision of his own. He could no longer stand by and watch these humans fight for him while he did nothing. His pride still fought against it, that voice in his mind that reminded him of who he was, of the power he once commanded. But that pride had left him alone and betrayed. Now here were these humans, showing him a different way. He couldn't just accept their help and do nothing. He had to fight alongside them. Though still physically weak, the king began advising the humans. His knowledge of advanced tactics and technology far surpassed their own, and he used that knowledge to help them prepare. The humans, for their part, listened without question. They didn't care about his status or his past. They only cared about survival and how best to achieve it. Together, they devised a plan, one that combined the humans' adaptability and ingenuity with the king's strategic mind and technological expertise. It was a strange alliance, one the king had never imagined he would be part of. He had once viewed these humans as beneath him, as creatures driven by emotion and weakness. Now, he saw their strength in a new light. Their loyalty, their willingness to sacrifice for one another, it was a power he had never fully understood but now found himself deeply respecting. The preparations continued, the tension in the air growing as the rebel fleet drew nearer. The humans worked with a focused determination, modifying their ship, setting up defenses, and ensuring that everyone was ready for what was to come. The king, too, took part in these preparations, though it still felt strange to him. He was not used to working with others, especially those he had once deemed inferior. But now, as he watched the humans work together, he realized that they were not inferior. They were different, yes, but in ways that made them stronger where it counted most. As the day of battle approached, the king felt a sense of unity that he had never experienced before. He was no longer the ruler issuing commands from on high, but a part of something greater than himself. For the first time, he was fighting not just for survival, but for the people who had saved him, who had shown him a side of life that his own species had forgotten. The alliance was strange, improbable, but it was real. The king, now fully healed, stood ready to face the rebel forces not as their prey, but as their equal. And he was no longer alone. The humans stood beside him, their weapons ready, their faces set in determination. They had no illusions about the battle to come. They knew the odds were against them, but they had something the rebels didn't, something the king's people had never understood. They had loyalty. They had each other. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. They were a force united by something far greater than technology or power. And for the first time in his long reign, the alien king felt truly prepared for what was to come. Not because of his own strength, but because of the strength of those who now stood with him. The rebel ships broke through the atmosphere, their engines roaring as they descended. They were larger, faster, and bristling with advanced weaponry far beyond anything the humans possessed. Their numbers seemed endless, an entire fleet dedicated to one purpose: erasing the alien king from existence. From the humans' vantage point on the ground, the sight was overwhelming. The rebel forces, confident in their superiority, landed with the precision of a well-oiled machine, believing the battle would be over before it even began. Tension gripped the air as the humans readied themselves, standing side by side with the alien king. The odds were impossible, the sheer number of enemies a stark reminder of their slim chances. But they didn't waver. They had come too far, made too many sacrifices, to turn back now. The king, watching the human soldiers preparing, felt a deep sense of unease. He knew what his people were capable of. He knew the ruthlessness of the rebel faction. And yet, here he was, standing among a species that, by all logical measures, should have retreated long ago. But retreat wasn't in the human's nature. The human commander, with the alien king at his side, laid out the final plan. They couldn't match the rebels in raw firepower, but they didn't have to. The humans had something the rebels didn't expect: adaptability. The planet's hostile environment, which had nearly killed the king, would now be their greatest ally. The humans had learned to move through the harsh terrain with ease, setting traps and ambush points in places the rebels would least expect. The king, lending his strategic knowledge of his own people's weaknesses, pointed out flaws in the rebels' typical formations. Together, human creativity and alien experience created a strategy that could level the playing field. As the battle began, the humans struck first, hitting the rebels from hidden positions with well-placed traps. The rebels, accustomed to straightforward, overwhelming assaults, found themselves bogged down in the rough landscape. Every corner they turned led to another ambush, every charge into human defenses met with improvised weapons that exploited the terrain. The humans, far from the technologically advanced warriors the rebels expected, fought with a fierce cunning that began to turn the tide. The alien king, now fully engaged in the battle, fought alongside the humans, a part of their unit rather than a distant commander. For the first time in his life, he wasn't directing a fight from the safety of a command center. He was in it, on the ground, seeing the battle through the eyes of the humans. And what he saw changed him. Despite the overwhelming odds, the humans didn't falter. They moved as one, supporting each other in ways that defied the cold logic of his people. A soldier would risk their life to drag a fallen comrade to safety, others would hold the line against impossible odds just to give their teammates a chance to regroup. It wasn't just their tactics that impressed him, it was their spirit, their refusal to give up, no matter how hopeless things seemed. In the chaos of battle, there came a moment when one of the human soldiers fell under heavy fire, trapped in an exposed position. The king saw it, saw the danger the soldier was in. He could have stayed back, safe within the defensive perimeter, letting the human deal with it. But something inside him shifted. The king, without hesitation, moved from his position, charging through enemy fire to pull the soldier to safety. It was an act that went against every instinct he had ever known. His pride, his belief in his superiority, all of it was sacrificed in that instant. The soldier, shaken but alive, looked up at the king with gratitude. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a bond forged in the heat of battle that neither of them could fully explain. The king, once a ruler who had looked down on these beings, had now fought for one of them. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to be part of something greater than himself. The rebels, realizing they were losing ground to a far smaller and less equipped force, regrouped for a final assault. But they had already lost the element of surprise. The human-alien alliance had proven far more resilient than they anticipated. The king, seeing an opportunity, rallied the remaining forces for a counterattack. With his tactical expertise and the humans' adaptability, they turned the battle in their favor. The rebel forces, once so sure of their victory, began to falter. In the final moments of the battle, the king led the charge, his once proud figure now marked by the dirt and scars of the fight, no longer the untouchable ruler he had been. The rebels, overwhelmed by the relentless attacks, retreated, their confidence shattered. The human-alien alliance had prevailed, against all odds. As the dust settled, the battlefield quiet in the aftermath of the fight, the king stood among the humans. They had won, but it wasn't just a victory in battle, it was a victory for something far more profound. The king, who had once been abandoned by his own people, had found a new kind of loyalty among the humans. They had risked everything for him, not out of obligation, but out of a shared sense of honor. And in return, he had fought for them, not out of duty, but because he believed in them. In the aftermath, the king reflected on how much he had changed. He had once ruled with an iron hand, believing that power was the only thing that mattered. But the humans had shown him a different path, one built on trust, loyalty, and compassion. It was a way of life his people had long since abandoned, but he now saw its value. The king pledged his loyalty to the humans, not as a ruler above them, but as an equal. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, his empire was still in disarray, and the rebels would likely return. But now, he was no longer alone. He had allies, friends even, who would stand with him, just as he had stood with them. And with that bond, he knew they could rebuild something greater than the empire he had lost, an alliance built not on power, but on the values the humans had taught him. In the end, the king realized that his transformation was complete. He had been abandoned by his people, but he had found something far more valuable. The humans had changed him, and in doing so, had opened his eyes to a future where loyalty and empathy, not just power, would define the new empire they would build together.